Following pre-recorded program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Welcome to About Money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments, surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared in the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
And it is Saturday, and we're going to be talking about money today, as we do on every Saturday. So I want to begin with three stories today, three separate stories. I'm going to tie them together so you can see how they apply. The purpose of this program is to give you insight into what's going on, what's going to happen, rather than giving you hindsight as to what has happened. We look forward for changes in technology, demographics, and lifestyles, because by doing that, you get a real insight into investing. So that's where we're going to begin today. I have a great guest who addresses a problem, a significant problem, and maybe even more so with COVID maybe. And I want to finish today because history doesn't repeat, but that it rhymes. And there's a new website with interesting and provoking information, provocative information, if I get the word right. But I want to begin today talking about something I've talked about in the past, but I think it ties together very nicely into what I have to say today. I want to start in 1878. George Eastman was 24 years old. He was a junior clerk in the Rochester Savings, and he wanted to take a vacation. He wanted to go to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, and he wanted to record the trip. But in those days, in 1878, it was a very big deal. Cameras were huge. They had to sit on a big tripod. You needed a big jug of water. You needed heavy plates and heavy plate holders. You needed glass tanks. You needed chemicals. And to develop the photograph, you needed a large tent where you could make it completely dark. That's what it was like to take a picture. It was a wet process. Well, Eastman never did go on that trip. He wanted a more portable solution. So he began to work in his kitchen even as he was clerking at Rochester Savings Bank. He began to work in his kitchen, and 2 years later, he came out with a dry plate formula, a dry plate way of taking pictures. He came out with a machine, with a formula for a dry plate, and he called it the Eastman Dry Plate Company. And a few years later, in 1884, it took him 4 years to come out with the idea of a roll of film. And in 1888, 4 years after that, he came out with a camera that could take a roll of film, and he put up a new slogan: "You press the button, we do the rest." And so was born the Eastman Company. But he wanted a more catchy name, and his favorite letter was the letter K. So in 1892, he changed the name of the company to the Eastman Kodak Company. Now, there was never a Kodak. There was never a person named Kodak. There was never a city named Kodak. There was never a county or state or anything named Kodak. Eastman just chose the name Kodak because he liked the letter K. And so was born the Eastman Kodak Company. And when he began that company, when it was born, he viewed it as a chemical supply and dry goods purveyor. But he soon realized that making photography every day was an everyday affair. And he wanted to make it as convenient as a pencil. That was his slogan, as convenient as a pencil. And so for the next 100 years, Eastman Kodak did exactly that. Now, fast forward to 1973. There's a young engineer, a graduate from Rensselaer Polytech Institute, and he takes an engineering job at Kodak. And his boss asked him for a very small request. his boss had heard about Fairchild Semiconductor inventing a charge-coupled device, a CCD. And it was an easy way to move an electronic charge around a transistor. Transistors were pretty new at that time, and they were pretty big. If you remember back to the 1950s and 60s, if you happened to be growing up at that time, transistors were pretty large. One or two transistors were the size of a quarter or a dime. But his boss wanted this young engineer to know if these devices, these charge-coupled devices, could be used for imaging. So his name was Sesson, and he used the CCDs to make the first digital still camera and digital recording device. Now, in the 70s, you can think about it like a 1970s Polaroid camera crossed with a speak and spell. The camera itself was the size of a pretty good-sized toaster. It weighed 8.5 pounds. It had fewer than 1,000 megapixels. The pictures were just black and white. And on a complete roll of film, you could only get 30 black and white images. And it had to be stored on an external device, a cassette tape. So it was really crude. But it was at Eastman Kodak Company that the very first digital camera was developed. Now, fast forward again from 1973 to 1996. Kodak has 140,000 employees, a $28 billion market cap, and effectively, they have a category monopoly. They own 90% of the film market and 85% of the camera market. And they viewed their business, they viewed themselves as being in the photographic business. That's what they thought of themselves. They didn't think of themselves as recording our lives, capturing the moment, recording the events and times. No, their business was photography. And they really saw the digital camera as something that undercut their chemical and photographic film business. And they didn't see how a 0.01 megapixel image camera could grow exponentially to provide high-resolution image. They had ignored it for all those years, and they continued to ignore it. Instead of dominating the market and using their dominating presence to corner the digital market, they let the market corner them. You know, Kodak had lasted for over 100 years, but you know where they are, overtaken and bankrupt. So that's the first story. And it relates to something that I've talked about before. Richard Foster of Yale said that the companies that dominated the Standard & Poor's in 1920 had an average life of 67 years, 70 years roughly. Today, it's down to 15 years. Babson School of Business said by 2025, 40% of the companies that existed in 1915 would be gone. You know, that's a significant change, and we see that Kodak lasted for a long time. So that brings me to the second story. A new report published this last week by British Petroleum, BP, came out and said that we are at peak oil. In their latest annual energy outlook, the 2020 edition, forecasting where energy was going in the next 30 years, BP said that while energy demand would continue to increase, the demand for oil would begin to decrease for the next 30 years. They said that global energy demand would continue to grow and would be driven by the emerging nations. I've talked any number of times in this program about the supercycle and the impact of a better than average GDP driven since 2009 primarily by those emerging nations BP came out and said global energy demand will continue to grow, and it's going to be driven by those emerging nations. The second point they made is that while energy demand will continue to grow, fossil fuel will decline as renewable energy grows. The third point was that there will be a transition to lower carbon energy with greater consumer choice and a restructuring of the global energy system into low carbon sources. The fourth point was that oil demand will decrease for the next 30 years as a function of increasing efficiency and electrification of road transportation, the electric car. The next point was that natural gas will be more resilient than oil in supporting fast-growing economies. Their next point was that renewable energy will be led by solar and wind power over the next 30 years. And electrical demand will increase significantly over the next 30 years. The next point was that there'll be a variety of new technologies for energy storage devices due to the intermittent nature of solar and wind. They're not always going. They're not always generating electricity. Their next point was that the use of hydrogen will increase as energy systems increase. They said that bioenergy, biofuels, biomethane, biomass will increase. And their last point was that the world's on an unsustainable path. A rapid and sustained fall in carbon emissions is likely to require a series of policy measures by all the governments. That was their point. We're going to come to a commercial break, so don't go away. Those were the first two stories. I want to relate the third story as well. So don't go away. I have a little more to say on this one. I'll be right back after the break.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial. About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
So I said that I was going to start with three stories and tie those together. So let me say a couple things. One, if you've been listening to the radio program, you already know that I've been saying much of the same thing for the last 6 years. Peak oil is going to occur. Now it's beginning to be realized in what BP said. But at the same time, the price of renewable energy has been coming down until it's actually cheaper than some of the fossil fuel energy sources. Around the world, coal mines are being converted to solar farms. And major international companies like Amazon and Microsoft, AT&T, Norsk Hydro, Alcoa, and Walmart, many others are converting to alternative energy sources for their new warehouses and office spaces and factories. That's happening, and it's going to continue to happen. Should also make one remark where there's a disagreement with what BP says. Susan Petty of Alta Rock was on our program. She developed a geothermal firm, and she mentioned that natural gas gives off methane, which is 20 times as lethal as CO2 in the atmosphere. Doesn't remain in the atmosphere forever, but it's 20 times. One other point that I have to make is it wasn't just BP that came out with their energy outlook. Other oil companies come out, Exxon and Chevron, and I looked at the Exxon estimate. They do the annual energy outlook as well. They also see energy demand increasing just like BP does. However, they see oil demand increasing for the next 30 years. They see that 30 years from now, oil will account for 50% of energy demand. 50%. BP says it's going to account for a very small little percentage. So I'm not sure if it's changed, but in 2016, the Exxon Energy Outlook said this. They said that electric vehicles would, by the year 2040, because they were just forecasting for 26 years then, 24 years, they were saying that electric vehicles would only account for 1% of cars sold in the year 2040. 1 billion cars would be sold. Only 1% of those would be electric vehicles. I said on my program in 2016, when I read that, I said, I would be surprised if it isn't 25%. I just bought a Tesla in 2015. I knew that electric cars were on their way. I said, I would be surprised if it wasn't 25%. Today, I will say, I believe that by 2040, if you want an internal combustion engine, it'll probably be a special order. Ford already plans an all-electric car assembly. VW said all-electric. And it's not, when they say they're going to go all-electric, it's not an easy transition. You know, if you look at VW, they come out and said that they go to 114 software vendors for their cars, for their software. Know how many Tesla uses? One. And Tesla does it all by themselves. I do have a Tesla, and I can tell you that on Sunday mornings at 1:40 a.m., if there's an upgrade to the car, it's downloaded into my car at 1:40 a.m. I didn't have auto parking. I didn't have auto driving. Both of those were added at 1:40 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Traditional cars, if you want an upgrade, you have to trade in and get the latest addition to the car. With Tesla, they download the software. But as other car companies make the transition, it's not going to be easy, but they're committed to it. Ford has committed $11 billion to begin the transition. But Exxon, if you look at Exxon doesn't seem to get it. Exxon sees oil growing to 50% of the energy demand by 2040 or 2050. They could be right, but my guess is that it's going to be British Petroleum. Friedman and Mandelbaum wrote a book called That Used to Be Us. And they said there are major issues facing the United States and the world over the next several decades. And the question is going to be how we manage those issues. The first issue they mentioned is energy and growth. You know, I've been talking for almost 10 years about the supercycle and an above average GDP growth driven by emerging nations. By 2030, the estimates are that 93% of the world's middle class will live in those emerging nations. 93%. They're becoming a major force in the world. And they're going to demand significantly more energy, much more energy. But at the same time, most energy sources currently today do things that put carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. Alternative energy, not so much so, but the fossil fuels do release carbon dioxide, or in the case of natural gas, methane into the atmosphere. And how does it work? I used the example any number of times saying, you can get a personal view of what greenhouse gases are when you drive your car in the summertime to go parking at some mall. If the malls are open and they haven't been for a while, but if in the old days, you can have your air conditioning on, it can be 80 degrees outside, your car's comfortable at 70 degrees, you get out, you go shopping for an hour or two, you come back to your car, it's still 80 degrees outside, but inside your car, it's 110 or 120 degrees. What happens is that the sun has been shining down on your car, and instead of reflecting the solar energy out, some of it is blocked by the top of your car. So you build up heat, which is over and above the heat that's on the outside. That's the same impact of greenhouse gases. The carbon dioxide sits up and deflects the sun energy back toward the earth instead of back into the atmosphere. That's the issue of carbon. That's the issue of what's happening with carbon. We need more energy. We're going to continue to use more energy, but that has an impact. If you look at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there was coal, oil, and natural gas. And the concentrations in the atmosphere were around 280 parts per million. And we know because scientists drill into the ice cap and measure it. In 2019, it had gone from 280 parts per million at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to 410 parts per million. And if you look at it on a more recent, in the last 8 years, it went from 390 to 410. And there's no dispute that that's happening, that's scientific, it's measurable. And what that means is that the Earth is warming up. From 1880 to 1970, the average temperature increased every decade by about 0.03 degrees centigrade, or about 1 degree Fahrenheit over the 190 years. From 1970 to today, temperatures are increasing at 0.13 centigrade per year, 4 times faster. That means that 1 degree Fahrenheit, the atmosphere is increasing by 1 degree Fahrenheit every 30 to 40 years. You know, if you look at the 5 hottest years since 1880, when we began to measure, the hottest years are 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. 9 of the 10 warmest years happened since 2005. The 10th was actually in 1998. So temperatures, worldwide temperatures are increasing. And they're not just a function of carbon emissions. They're a function of sun and atmospheric winds as well, which should make things colder, not warmer. So think about this. Almost 90% of the marine glaciers have retreated since 1940. Ice is melting and it's raising water in the oceans. We see that in places like New York and New Jersey, and we're seeing it in the West as well. There's not enough frozen water in Greenland. There's enough frozen water in Greenland and Antarctica to raise the global sea levels 230 feet if it completely melts. So it doesn't have to completely melt, it just has to partially melt. And when the climate warms up, it doesn't just mean we end up with hotter times, and we will end up with hot times. But when you have a warmer atmosphere, warmer air holds more water vapor. And that means snows are heavier, rains are wetter, heavier storms will come in some places, less rainfall in others. You'll see heat waves, heavy snowfalls, floods, forest fires, landslides, hurricanes, global weirding. All this means that we are seeing a complete change happening, and you can roll that into companies that are going to die and companies that are going to succeed. That's the focus of looking at changes in technology, demographics, and lifestyles. It's important to understand that and where things are headed. We're going to talk more and more about that during the next few weeks. We're talking and drawing some pictures because those things affect how investments should be made and where they should be made. And looking at traditional companies, knowing that a number of traditional companies will be going the way of Eastman Kodak. Being in the right companies is going to be dramatically important. Being in the right companies is going to make a big difference. The Standard & Poor's has companies, new companies coming in, companies that are dying. You want to be in the companies that are emerging, not those that are dying. Stay with me. When we come back, I'm going to have a guest. You'll want to hear what he has to say. And we will also be talking about the 1970s. Stay with me. We'll be right back with a lot of them.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial Concepts. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
Welcome back. I have a guest today who has a company which I think is extremely important. It solves or works on a social problem. I think makes sense. It's a one that's it will be a profitable company. I have to disclose that I am a member of the board of directors, so I want that to be known as well. So I want to introduce my guest today. It's Craig Kobayashi of Factimize. Welcome to the program, Craig.
Hello, Michael, and thank you for having me on your show.
Thanks. So, Craig, why don't we start with your background?
Well, currently I am the Chief Program Manager of Factimize, and what that means is that I like having that kind of a title because it means that I'm involved with the company in all aspects of its operations. So rather than being an executive that just manages the company, I also get involved in the actual operations of it. So in the past, I've also had a legal background, but that was several years ago, Michael, and I haven't been doing that for a long time. So,
but you were an attorney at one time.
Yeah, I admit that I was an attorney some time ago. Yes, that's true, Michael.
So why don't we start? Tell us about what Factimize is.
So Factimize is a company that uses technology to solve some problems that are very difficult to do. We have an electronic digital diary that takes electronic files and then puts them into a secure account for our customers. And then it takes these files and organizes them in a way that allows people to see patterns of behavior. Currently, we're using Factimize in our digital diary to help parents who are engaged in difficult child custody disputes, where one or even both parents have personality disorders, high conflict personality disorders such as narcissism, borderline, and antisocial personality disorders. And one characteristic of these parents, Michael, is that they generate lots of communications, electronic communications between themselves. So they text a lot, they send emails a lot, and if they're ordered by the court to use certain kinds of communication platforms like Our Family Wizard or Talking Parents or other services like that, they generate lots of communications, and these are really difficult for the legal professionals as well as the mental health professionals involved in the family disputes in order for them to take a look at that and sort through that. But we help people see the picture by taking this information and using a consistent process. We are able to display patterns of behavior on a timeline, a graphical timeline, where people can see patterns of behavior over time.
So when you're talking about child custody, you're talking about a significant problem. Tell us a little bit about the impact of that on a couple and on their children.
Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to do is to help everybody involved in this family law process to make the best decisions for the best interest of the children. And that's something that gets confused a lot, particularly when one of the parents has this kind of high conflict personality disorder. And so what we're able to do is to at least show, looking at 100% of the data that these parents can generate, we're able to demonstrate patterns of behavior which in many cases do not validate what one parent who has the personality disorder is trying to claim. You know, in effect, what we're trying to do is to demonstrate that sometimes these people with personality disorders tend to distort or even fabricate the kinds of issues or events or circumstances that are going on. And usually that's, in most cases, that's not in the best interest of the children. And we want to be able to provide a way in which family law professionals, the lawyers, the evaluators, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, and even the judges involved in these things, we want to be able to show them patterns of behavior where we can at least provide a different way of having people look at pictures and determine what is the truth about the matter being discussed between the parents.
So when somebody goes to court, for example, a couple goes to court and they argue, they have, as I understand it, like 20 minutes to make their case. And so the judge has very limited information on what's gone on for what may be several years of communication. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's sort of the unfortunate circumstance of what's going on today with the way that our family law system works. Oftentimes these cases turn into a he said, she said kind of dispute, where both parents, as you say, argue in front of the judge for 20 minutes apiece or 40 minutes, if even that in total. And the judge then has to make a decision about which parent is the more credible witness. And oftentimes the more credible witness appears to be the parent that has the high conflict personality disorder, because these people are charismatic and persuasive and a lot more believable than the other parent who's been on the receiving end of this kind of behavior, this kind of high conflict personality disorder behavior. And so as a consequence of that, the other parent doesn't appear to be as articulate or as convincing as a parent with the disorder. And that is the basis for a lot of the problems and frankly, the bad decisions that get made when it comes to how custody decisions are made and how the judge awards certain kinds of custody rights. So our system shows these people over time all of the kinds of patterns of behavior, and we're able to show what parents have been saying and doing and how they're treating their children. And the system can take all of the information into account when they're looking at how this works and make a better decision looking at all of the data.
So in that respect, attorneys can also look through the information and sort through it. So what's the advantage of using Pattern Viewer as compared to having an attorney sort through 700 or 800 emails?
Well, one thing about attorneys, or even for that matter, evaluators or psychologists or psychiatrists looking at hundreds and hundreds of pieces of data, that there simply isn't enough time for these people to do it. And they charge an hourly rate. And frankly, oftentimes it's very difficult to keep track of a huge amount of emails and text messages that are going between the parents. And if they were to do so and charge their hourly rate, in some cases, it could be in the tens of thousands. Say, for instance, for 750 pieces of data, parents could be charged up to $35,000 to $40,000 just to look at the data. What we do is charge a flat fee, around $6,000, in order to review and process this information. And we can provide this for not only can we provide this for one attorney, but we could provide it to a psychiatrist who may have the same need to review this data as well.
So you do it better and cheaper and more effectively.
Yeah, and one thing that we can do is provide the parents with this. We can provide them with a way to bring order out of chaos. We can also, in addition to providing order out of chaos, we can also give the parents hope that someone can look at all of the data and see if there are patterns that have been prevalent during this time so that a better decision can be made. And finally, we do all this by providing evidentiary data visualization. Now, that's kind of a long description, but what we do is basically believe that when people see pictures, that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that's a lot easier for people to understand what's going on when it looks at patterns of behavior involving these kind of complex issues.
So how would somebody get a hold of you if they know of someone who's going through a custody battle, or if they themselves are going through a custody battle?
Well, the easiest for them to do so is by just looking up our website. It's www.factimize.com. Factimize.
Factimize. Do log on to it if you or you know someone that is in a high conflict situation. We're coming to a commercial break. Don't go away, because we've got a lot more to cover in the last segment. We're going to be talking about the 70s and the significance.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial. About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
So, there's a new website out that I stumbled across called WTF Happened in 1971. Not the normal WTF, what the F. This is what the future happened in 1971. As we come out of this whole thing, I've been talking sometimes before COVID to after COVID, before the coronavirus to after the coronavirus. There are going to be changes, and each time we go through one of these downturns, it seems like there's a fundamental shift. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And when you go through these, there's changes in demographics, technologies, and lifestyles. It's a reason for my investment philosophy. That's what I focus on. It's also the focus of this radio program is to put you ahead of the curve than behind the curve. You know, that's why I am 2 to 3% per year on the average, better than the Standard & Poor's 500, because the Standard & Poor's contains new companies that are emerging and old ones that are dying. I talked about it in the first part of the program. There's lessons from history, and that's what I want to talk about. This website, I found it extraordinary, actually. What happened in 1971, there was a fundamental shift in the economy. And what the website is it's just a bunch of charts and graphs, but it paints a picture in pictures of what went on. Because if you look at it, for example, in wages were rising steadily through the 1960s. And then in real terms, wages flatlined after 1973, and they've continued through this day. That's a period of 47 years where we've had a flat line. Through the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, wages were steadily rising, and then it stopped. And from 1947 to 1973, income at all levels were rising the same. The top earners, the top 5%, the top 1%, they were seeing their incomes increase at the same rate as the bottom 5%, or the bottom 10%, at the middle. Wages were increasing consistently through all income levels. In 1973, the top 5% continued to increase, and the bottom 95% flatlined. If you look at the top 1%, they make close to 25 today. They make close to 25% of all income that's earned. You know, if income was evenly distributed, the top 1% would get 1% of the income. The bottom 1% would get 1%. Incomes are never completely flat or equally distributed. You have the high earners and the low earners. But if you look right now, the top 1% get 25% of all income that's generated. You know, that's a significant change that's happened since 1973. If you look at the chart on productivity, the productivity per capita from 1948 to 2017, from 1948 to 2017, productivity increased by 248%. Generally, income should keep up with that, but the fact is, from 1948 to 2017, income has only grown by 115%, and much of that has gone to the upper 1%. If you look at GDP per capita, it's grown 325%. Income, 115%. So there's been a dramatic shift. And if you look at some of the other charts, the income disparity is spelled out, but there's even more. Budget deficits began to soar in the 1970s. Trade balances began to soar. Savings rates began to tumble. The share of 25 to 29-year-olds living with their parents increased threefold today from what it was in 1973. And it was a kind of steady increase. It wasn't a sudden bump up during the Great Recession. No, it's been increasing since 1973. The median marriage age increased. In 1973, it was an average age of 21 for females, 23 for males. Today, it's 28 for females and 30 years old for males. The percent of children born to unmarried women has skyrocketed. And it's not just in one demographic. It's not just blacks or Hispanics. It's every demographic, every race. It has been skyrocketing. And if you look at the childhood obesity, it's increased by over 20% during those times. If you look at the health expenditures per capita, health expenditures, it's skyrocketed 15 to 20-fold. So why the changes? What we went through in that period of time was dramatic. We went through the oil crisis during that period of time. 1972, 1973 was the oil crisis. Inflation had been already picking up, but when we hit 1973, we had the intensive oil increase. Ian Nordhaus got the Nobel Prize in economics when he showed that the oil-intensive industries amounted for 2/3 of the productivity slowdown since 1973. It changed innovations. Companies were no longer able to depend upon cheap oil. They had to find other means. Oil was a big improvement over coal up to that time. But we had, during that period of time prior to 1973, a transportation industry. We had airlines and trucks and cars. And remember, in 1973, the big cars were getting 6 to 10 miles per gallon. That's unbelievable in today's world. And there was an increase beginning in the 1970s to conserve energy and make things more efficient. The highest per capita oil consumption was in the year 1972 and 1973. Since that period of time, the average oil consumption per capita has been decreasing. Now, the number of people is increasing, and so that's been increasing the oil consumption in the U.S., but the per capita has been increasing. And we saw a shift into services from manufacturing due to the oil, or partly due to the oil, partly due to computers. Tremendous change in computers. We saw a change in demographics. We were living longer, and that meant that medical expenses and transportation costs were increasing dramatically. When I said that healthcare costs increased 15 to 20 times, part of that is living longer and better healthcare. Lifestyles changed. I talked about marriage, and one of the lifestyles that's changed has been even retirement and the way we live in retirement. The Great Generation, the World War II generation, they wanted to live in communities. Baby boomers have looked at second homes and living individuals. As the millennials come along, there's a lot of a change seeing parents living close to or with their children. 1970s, a dramatic shift. That gives us some insight into what's going on today when we come out of actually two things: the Great Recession and the coronavirus pandemic, we'll have much more of a shift in the economics. There are going to be benefits to that if you invest in the right place. That wraps up today. I will be back next Saturday with more information about money. Stay with me at that time. So much to do, so much to see. Until next Saturday.
You've been listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Saturday at noon for more About Money with Mike Adams, here on AM 1590. The Answer. The preceding program was sponsored by Adams Financial